What's going on, guys? This is Patrick again. Thanks a lot for tuning in. We got a really cool class for you today. I noticed a lot of you guys have been hitting me up about not being able to get your renders looking really realistic, or what to do about making realistic shadows. So I'm going to show you exactly how I do that, making my own HDRI images using literally nothing but my phone to take 360-degree panoramic photos and wrap them around my project. So we're going to be going over that. We'll need Cinema 4D and Photoshop just for coloring a little bit. I'm going to show you exactly what makes a good HDRI, what makes it bad, or what makes it better for certain circumstances, but we'll be going through a lot. So let's jump into it, start taking some photos. Alright guys, so we're on the second location now. It's actually one floor above where we were last time, and you'll notice now that we got lighting coming from all directions, natural light. We got the sun pretty much on top of us, and it's not necessarily bad. In fact, it's still going to give us really realistic lighting. The only difference is probably going to be, one, what it's reflecting, and two, the harshness of the shadows we're going to get. So if you're looking for something really harsh and a lot of outstanding shadows, the last location is probably what you're going to want to go more towards, because we had lighting coming from a clear one direction, but this one we got all directions, and I'll show you again in post the differences from what it'll look like in the same scene. So I'll show you exactly what that HDR will look like, and I'll show you what this one will look like. But these are just a couple of the ones that you could take. You can just imagine any location you can find with really cool architecture. It'll make really cool reflections in your objects. Yeah, so this is the second one. Let's go back in and apply these. Alright guys, so we're here in this parking garage, 5th floor, and I wanted to use this one for an example because, as you'll see, there's a lot of natural light coming in from here and over here, but if you'll notice, behind over there, there's almost no natural light coming in, and that will act more towards contrast and creating nice shadows from this side, because it's technically the same thing as putting a light source over here, having an object right here. It would create a nice shadow going this way. If you want some really nice shadowing, you're going to want images with a bunch of light on one side and maybe a little less on the other side, because if you get light from all directions, we all know that that creates for a really flat image, and that's not always what we want. So we're going to take our phone here and go to the panoramic feature for using an iPhone, and I'll just start right here, go around. I'm going to get the camera guy right in this one and then stop. So we're getting like a 360-degree image when So when it's wrapped around, it actually wasn't 360 degrees, but it really doesn't matter because it's going to look realistic either way when being reflected from the objects. So when we wrap this around the dome that we create, you'll see that it's not only going to reflect properly, but it's also going to emit light from the light parts of the image, which creates for the really nice shadows because we have light coming from one side and darkness coming from the other side, a little darker. And so let's go to the next location. Alright guys, so we're here in Photoshop. This is the photo editing program I use the most. You can probably find a bunch of free ones if you don't. You could even probably use iPhoto for certain stuff like this, just to do basic coloring that we're about to do. But as you can see here, oh yeah, shout out to my boy Brian Wanjugu. He was the one filming me earlier. He got in the shot. He was also generous enough to let me use his lavalier mics, which allowed me to sound much better, and it was much easier to understand me out there instead of my last video where I didn't really have my mics. We were just relying on the camera audio, so appreciate you, man. So if you look at this picture here, this is exactly what I was talking about. It's a little easier to explain here because if you notice, there's a clear dark half of the picture and there's a clear bright half. And what I was kind of equating that to was literally setting one light up on one side of an object and not really having that much light on the other side. Because once you wrap this around, which we'll do in the next segment or so, the objects being placed in this atmosphere obviously would have shadows similarly to this car, which you see is giving a harsh shadow here because the lighting source is right here, and all these other cars here giving off shadows. And as you see, because there's no light source coming from this direction, there's not really any shadows coming from these cars over here. So again, it's really all about how you guys want your objects in the project to look, and what kind of shadowing, what kind of lighting, and what they're reflecting. So another thing I wanted to go through before actually editing this photo was, just color. And this one actually looks really good. I'm not going to have to change too much because it already looks pretty white balanced. Nothing looks way too cool or way too warm. What I mean by that is if I go to filter camera raw and I start messing with the colors here, so you'll see here you have the temperature settings here, and a lot of times if your camera isn't white balanced correctly, it'll look a little too warm or it'll look a little too cool like this. Especially during the day, a lot of times it'll look like this, but we were fortunate enough to have it pretty even, so I'm not really even going to mess with that. And it's important to change these settings now before applying them to Cinema 4D, because then you're not really going to have accurate lighting, because what we really want to do is make everything even when making our project in Cinema 4D, and then later coming back and having all the freedom to adjust these settings once the final render is out. So this looks good here. I might just brighten up this a little bit by pushing the blacks, and again it's all how you want this to look. So we're getting a little more information out here just by going like this, which again will probably take down the shadows a little bit, but it's also brightening this part as well. So I might just go in the middle or something. And again, you'll really see this stuff once I start applying these in Cinema. But I'd say this looks good for me. I'm not going to mess with the color. Everything looks pretty flat and pretty even, so I'm good with that. So I'm going to click OK. And you can save this how it is. Save this in a folder that you'll use once you're picking your HDRIs in Cinema. So this one's good. On to the next one. Again, you'll be able to see that unlike this one where there's a light and a dark side, but yeah, if you'll notice again, there's light coming from all directions now. Like every part of this image is bright, which is useful in many instances. Sometimes
it isn't if you want these really harsh, contrasty shadows coming from the objects. But you know, there is still some contrast in this image, because you just see where the sun was closest to, it is definitely brighter around here than here. So it's still going to give you not really that flat of an image, a flatter image maybe. But I guess I'm using flat as a negative term. I would say more even, because either way, putting an object in this atmosphere is not going to create a bad looking image, because it still has really mixed up values. You know, it's got some yellow here, it's got some different shades here, darker hue of blue, and once we actually put objects in this atmosphere, it's going to reflect these things just as nicely as before. And it's always helpful. Again, I was using my phone, but if you guys are fortunate enough to have a DSLR or anything like that that can handle more of these light values, so you can push the colors more, it's always nice to have a moderately unedited image like this, so it's not really saturated, not really colored or anything, not stylized, but also captures the full sky. So it's not, you know, we're getting a little bit of clipping here, it's a little hot here with the clouds losing some information, but that will be totally fine for using in cinema. But you know, images where the whole sky is white, that's usually not preferable. Sometimes it'll just look like clouds when reflecting from the image, but for this it looks pretty fine. And we're just going to check to make sure. Again, this one looks cool too, because it doesn't look way too warm or way too cold. And I'm pretty happy with this. Sometimes I like to press the highlights down to see if we can recover any information here. And it looks like we can, so I guess I'll keep that a little bit. I don't want it to look too too cartoonistic, or whatever you call it, by removing too much information from the clouds. But something like that might be cool. And then we definitely don't want something like this, because that's starting to look really stylized, and we want something to look really natural, and it looked like we just took it out of the camera. So something like this, push the blacks down a little bit maybe. But this looks pretty good. And I'm happy with this, so we can close this out. And you can save this. So both of these images are currently ready for Cinema 4D, and we'll start working with these in the next section. All right, so we got this finished image here, and again, you know, I didn't texture the floor other than putting a little bit of roughness on here. So the point was not to make this extravagant scene here with a bunch of realistic elements. It was just to get the lighting, and I wanted a somewhat realistic texture. I might have gone a little too hard with the bump, but nevertheless, you get the idea. And we'll bring this to life a little bit more in Photoshop. So we're going to save as a 16-bit TIFF, and we're going to click OK. And just save this as, I don't know, tutorial TIFF HDRI. And we're going to go to Photoshop here, like we had it, and we're going to take this image, drag it, and we're going to duplicate the layer as always by clicking Command J, so we can edit non-destructively. I don't like editing on the main background layer, and convert this for smart filters so we can always go back and edit these settings later. But because it's 16-bit TIFF, it has more information that we can kind of bend the colors how we want without it distorting as much. So first thing I was like doing, let's kind of drag the blacks up here, and let's see. Let's try dragging some contrast back into this thing, taking some grain in the effects tab. That was like some photorealistic grain. So don't try to go too unrealistic. When I was saying before with the temperatures, this is where you can start editing how you want your photo to look. You don't want to already have this edited, because if this was all orange like that, then you're kind of stuck with this orange tinted image already. So then you got to play with the colors as if it's already colored a certain way. So you want this like nice even image to start with. You know, I might take this here a little bit, add some green, and go to the split toning, add some red, and add some highlights, and take this up to like maybe here. Tone it down a bit. We don't need as much red. Maybe not as much green even. Take this back. Matter of fact, I don't even think we need that much red at all. Tiny bit. So we're starting to get somewhere here. I do want a little bit of green highlights, and maybe boost this up a little bit. But you can see how messing with these values, we're already getting something. Maybe adding a little vibrance. And before, it's much more flat than you even thought. We're getting the finished image. And, you know, it's starting to look a little stylistic with how much color we're popping into this thing and the noise. So we can take the grain down a little bit. It's always good to see before and after, because sometimes this looks flawless and sometimes you went a little too overboard with it, you know, editing it. So I'm going to take these values back a little bit. Keep a little bit. See the vibrance. Maybe take that 8. Saturation, sometimes I like to use. Starting to look like a mini Earth, actually, a little bit. Just the way these things are. Looks like these like little cloud areas. So that looks cool. And, you know, I'm pretty happy with this. Looks pretty decent to me. Again, I wish I put a little bit less bump, because this thing just looks very rough, the surface of this thing. But I'm pretty satisfied. It's ready for the next step, and because we're editing in smart layers, we can always go back. So double click the camera raw icon, and all the settings are here, so it's not flattened or anything. But if you already see, we've added a lot, including grain, to make it look a little bit more photorealistic. The last thing I do is add a hue and saturation adjustment layer by clicking on this icon right here and changing these values a little bit, just to see if I like other color combinations that make this thing much more stylized. And a lot of times I actually end up doing this and picking something totally different. So if I take this down a little bit, maybe over here, that's, you know, I'm happy with this, you know, and, you know, this, it's giving this guy like a purplish tint to his skin color, but it really doesn't, you know, this is, we're still kind of on the abstract level here, and we want something stylized. We don't want everything looking too realistic, so I'm just going to choose this right here, and then I'm just going to save it out, export, save for web, just like this, 100% quality, 1080 by 1080, perfect for Instagram. So I'm just going to save it like that, and so that's really it, guys. You know, we went outside, we took these HDRI images. It really took us 2 seconds, minus me talking and explaining some things. So you can see we only went to 2 locations, and it was really the same locations, just different levels. So just get creative with it. You can do it inside, outside. Just make sure you have decent lighting. Remember to make them realistic. If you like this, guys, please give a rating. And your project that I'm going to assign is simply taking your own HDRIs, and I want you guys to upload the HDRIs that you took into the project along with your finished render, so I can see which images you wrapped around and how it actually turned out in the render, so I can give you some good feedback as well. But I really appreciate you guys watching, and we'll stick around for the next one. Alright guys, so we're here in Cinema 4D and we got a blank template here, and again with this class I'm not going to go over everything start to finish. I'm just going to try to get us to a good point so we can see the different applications of these HDRIs that we took. So I'm just going to make a floor, start off there, scale it up a little bit and make a camera, hop in the render view, make sure we're all set in both viewports. And so what I'm going to do is change the camera placement to, or change the focal length to telephoto 135 millimeters so we get most of the floor on here, because I really just want to get a good feel of how the shadows and the materials are reacting to the HDRI. So I'm going to create just a sphere, classic, and make sure we're on top of this thing here. Matter of fact, we can actually move the floor down. There we go. Just so it's sitting on there nicely. And I'm going to take the segments up to like 40 maybe. And let's see where we're at here. Scale this up a little bit. Just get in a good position. And again, actually, we really don't, it doesn't matter for this purpose whether anything falls off here, because again, for the sake of this class, I'm just looking for the shadowing and the reflections of the materials. So what I'm going to do is create a dome, which will be the HDRI wrap around. So we're around this whole thing here. We've wrapped around, if I hop out of the camera, we created a dome, much like I do in the other classes. And I'm going to make a material that I created here and apply it to the dome. And make sure I check on ambient occlusion and global illumination here. In the render settings, we're on the physical here. And again, make sure in the physical channel we're set to progressive so we can see a fast render, and set all these values to like 2. And subsurface scattering we can take down to 0 actually, because I don't think we're going to use that now. Global illumination, all these settings, take the sample count, custom, I usually make it 20 when I kind of want to get a fast result before I actually start bumping these out. And you'll see that when I pop up my interactive render region here by clicking Option R, it's black because we haven't assigned any excess external light. So with this material painted on the dome, we're going to kill the color and the reflectance. We just have this black dome around everything, and we're going to check on the luminance channel, and now we got light coming from all directions, so it looks pretty flat. So what we're going to do is take this texture, load image, and go to HDRIs, and here we got the image, the first image that we got, and we can take a look at how this looks. So let's just bump this in. And remember, when you're exporting, I guess I should have said this back then, but make sure when you're exporting these images, you're not compromising the resolution, because it's always the more information we have for these purposes, the better. So mine was like 8,000 by 1,000 pixels, which is a pretty big image. It's a panorama. So I'm going to open this, and let's see what we got. So already we're getting a ton of, you can see lighting coming from this side, completely dark on this side. And what I want to do is actually hop out of here so I can see what's going on here. And I'm just going to rotate the dome. You can see as I rotate, I'm literally changing the light source. So if I want the light, all the light to come from this direction, and you see this cuts here, which is totally fine, because it's not, when we're going to be zoomed in the camera, you're not really going to be able to tell what's going on, which will be totally fine. And more specifically, if we were to change the angle for this class, it doesn't matter, but make it so you kind of hide that stuff. And there's other ways to get around making a full 360-degree image that I can go over in a later class. But for this looks nice, and we're getting, you see it looks nice, but it's looking a little dark, and we're getting some splotches, which is perfectly normal with the settings we have. We have a really low sample count, and you'll see if I go to 10 samples, it gets even worse. Much more splotchiness. If you go to 5, worse. 1, It's all pretty much the same ballpark. But if we were to take this to like 100, we're getting rid of a lot of those samples, and we go to like 200. Oops, wow, that's way too much. 200. We're almost completely getting rid of a lot of these splotches. So any of you guys who are submitting projects to me that have a lot of those splotches, a lot of it has to do with this value. Along with if you were to set like plain lights up, going to this illumination tab and clicking GI area light. So that helps eliminate some of that as well. But we're going to go back to 20 for now just so we can get a faster render. And I think I want to bump up the brightness of this HDRI as well. So what I'm going to do is go to this material, the HDRI, and you notice you got the brightness here, but you can go as far up as you want. But notice that I went much higher and it stays completely the same. And that is simply because you have to change the mix mode to something like multiply. So now we're getting something much brighter, obviously way too bright. I want to start with like maybe 120. All right, so that's looking better. And this really has something to do with how dark or how bright you want your actual render. So if we were to apply a material to the sphere, and let's give it a reflection legacy. So you'll see right off the bat, you see how realistic all these reflections are, simply because we're using an image that we already made, using our phone, really. And notice that this guy's head's getting cut off. So a lot of the times, this is the camera guy right here, a lot of the times your default setting when you place this HDRI is a little too cropped low. So if you jump out of the camera, you got to just kind of feel it out. So obviously this is not realistic at all. So we're just going to move this up to something like this, where it's going to give us a much more realistic feel. This looks like much more of something we would see rather than him being way cropped down. And again, it all has to do with, strategically taking your photos, and depending on how specific you want to be, 99% of the people won't even pay attention to that. As long as we got something that looks like it's giving realistic reflections, it'll be fine. Not to mention all of the other stuff we might do to this thing, like adding some bumps to where you can't even tell what kind of reflection's going on. So like I referenced being a magician last time, a lot of this stuff really doesn't have to be as crazy as it seems. You just got to kind of make it look realistic to the general public. So even something like that looks really cool with just a subtle bump. And now we're getting, you'd never be able to tell the difference between whether we used a phone or a crazy DSLR panoramic 100% realistic image, 360 degree image. Because remember, this is not even 360 degrees. This is like 180, I think. So technically, we're not even going the full way. I was just showing you how to take like 180 degree image. But for everything that I do and everything that I've learned by myself doing this, this gets me a great image that I'm happy with, and 90% of the people, think it looks realistic, and that's really all it's about. Not to mention doing more things like adding depth of field, checking that on, and because we have a telephoto lens on, checking this thing, the f-stop, putting that to like maybe 0.6. Everything's going to be blurry now, and setting the focus maybe like right here. So again, we're getting a crystal sharp focus right here, and in the back we're getting blurs. And we haven't even messed with floor textures. We haven't done anything in the floor. Again, we're getting splotchiness because of the samples that we have. But you can imagine actually texturing these things using another class we already went over of how to create your own textures, using those elements mixed with how to take your HDRI, mixed with the render settings with the other class. We're starting to be able to make these full projects fully self-sufficient and not having to rely on other people's works or anything, which is always a good thing. And we've only spent a couple minutes here trying to create something. And even as something as simple as a marble, you can see the reflections we got already going. So I just want to show you the difference between maybe this HDRI and the other one. So let's go make another material for the other HDRI. Matter of fact, I'm actually going to copy, duplicate this one right here, and I'm going to drag this on as well. and instead of the, let's take this down to 100 again, because we definitely don't want it to be too, let me take this off real quick. We definitely don't want it to be too bright with this next image. So this next image we choose, let's go load image. It should be this one. Yep, outside on the rooftop. Let's see what it does. So right off the bat, we're getting something way different. And notice there's not crazy shadowing coming from any direction. That's literally what I was talking about, making those last videos. Because, we're still getting realistic elements. We're getting realistic lighting, realistic reflections, but we're just not getting as much contrast. And, some of that stuff will be, the shadows will come from other elements you have in the scene, or some of that stuff will be through the textures you put on your floor, or, there's so many different variables that you have to think about. So for some people, this looks great. And remember, because notice this image looks pretty flat and doesn't look too cool, doesn't look too warm. It's pretty neutral. And this is exactly what we want when making these images in Cinema 4D, because once we bump them out, we have the freedom to do them later on in Photoshop. And that's, remember when we were editing the colors, making sure everything was pretty flat and neutral before putting them into Cinema 4D. That's what you want before, again, taking them back into Photoshop once we've rendered this image and being able to manipulate those colors the right way. So this is a little bit look at the last, let's zoom in here. This is the last HDRI we took. Let's change this f-stop to 1 again. And maybe the focus distance here. Oops. Not 0.01, 1. So, and again, we're still getting like a blurry image because we haven't, this is just the pre-render. So let's see what we got here. So we're getting, again, even though we're using this image that has lighting from all directions, this still has the potential to actually look photorealistic, hyper-realistic after post. And again, it has everything to do with, completing the actual render. So it's the floor textures, it's the lighting we got. The lighting's a huge part of it. I would say it's at least 50%, maybe more. And Photoshop, to me, takes an 80% image to 100% easily, realistic-wise. So, I've gone over how to edit photos as well in Cinema 4D, and maybe I will attach to this video. But I think, for the most part, you get the idea. So we've made 2 HDRIs, one with a lot of contrast, like before. If we go back to this one, and one we made with a much less contrasty looking photo. So this is the image we got right now, and actually this is with the brightness only set to 100, and I'm really happy with this as far as the lighting goes, because we can see the clear reflections, especially with the bumps. So it looks realistic to me. And again, we haven't changed the splotchiness. We got depth of field. We haven't even messed with the floor really. But I guess I can actually have another part here. So I'm just going to increase the size of this. I'm not even going to texture the floor. This is mostly on just the lighting of this thing. And the only thing I'll do to the floor maybe is take this down and add a reflection to it or something with a little bit of roughness. And maybe this will be good enough. So something like this. So I'll literally, let me take the f-stop to like 1.4. And I'm really not going to do anything else to this other than just bump it out, and I'll show you how I kind of, bring this fully to life. Again, for this class, I'm not going to go crazy because I'm going to save some stuff for other classes. But just as far as the lighting goes, this looks like a great image already. Just by using a texture just by using an HDRI that we made in 2 seconds by going outside. So I'm just going to change the settings here, going from 2 all two values to 4. And taking this to fixed, taking it to medium. I actually like this at 5. And going to the global illumination, let's take this to like 1, because it's simple, let's take it to 150. And that should be good now. Let's take this to 1080 by 1080. And I'm happy with this. And again, we're only using one sphere, one simple sphere. And, you know, it's your choice whether you want to take this same texture, put it on a bunch of these spheres, and make them look like marbles on the ground. But for this class, I'm just going to keep it simple, and I'm going to render this out like it is. So let's see how that looks. And again, because this is fairly simple, it shouldn't take too long.